Welcome to Neo Academia, where you'll hear real conversations with trailblazing thinkers outside the ivory tower. I'm your host, Natasha Mott, and this week I invited evolutionary biologist, writer, and co-host of the Dark Horse podcast, Heather Hying, to have a discussion about science, of course, and academia, of course. Heather is well known for voicing her thoughts on the COVID-19 pandemic and for issues relating to diversity and inclusion efforts. What I hope you get to see here is a different side of Heather, one not so embroiled in controversy, but still thinking critically because that is what she sets out to do. Today we focus specifically on what it means to do science now, in the past, and how we educate those who will do it in the future. Heather, like all my guests, is one of those people who I couldn't wait to get in a setting where we could talk candidly about how she handles criticism, her hopes, her guesses. I want to bring scholars and thinkers like Heather closer to you so you can take them in good faith, realize they're human, and evaluate their arguments and philosophies rather than the sound bites or their follower count or supposed authority or lack thereof. So if you value this, I hope you'll consider supporting Neo Academia by subscribing and maybe upgrading to a premium Substack subscription where you'll get even more of my thoughts and my guests and behind-the-scenes footage, monthly rabbit hole newsletters, and much more. Season 2 of Neo Academia is also possible thanks to Big Nerve, the idea tournament game for innovative thinkers. I've been working with Big Nerve to help develop a community of creative people who enjoy playing with ideas and getting better at combining rational argument with creative imagination. Their goal is simple. They want to recognize and fund brilliant idea people like us and create a new profession called innovators. They do this by providing a platform for catalysts like me to ask engaging questions that creative innovators like you can answer. The answers to these questions are then rated for their creativity, and points are awarded for each aspect of the game. At the end of the month, the idea tournaments pay out to the top 33% of participants and scouts who are building their team of innovative thinkers. Cha-ching, cha-ching. Yeah, I don't know why I said that. The founders of Big Nerve have worked hard on creating a game that will elevate innovative thinkers and their ideas. Now, to join my team, you'll have to click on the Big Nerve question in the Theory Gang newsletter, where each episode I'll design a special question relevant to the guest and discussion. All right, let's get into this episode. Now, listen to the very end so you can hear the Big Nerve question, and maybe you'll hear some clues as to how I'm thinking about my answer to the question. So I don't really do an introduction.
Fair enough.
I just, I do a little preamble about it on my Substack, and, you're one of these people who I think, for better or worse, is become pretty well known recently. So speaking of that, I know why you were kind of forced into starting your pursuit as what could probably be described as a public intellectual, but also an independent scholar. So starting back from Evergreen, we won't rehash all of that. But I met Brett in probably 2018 when we were in Portland, and I was working on the March for Science, and we needed a keynote. And I said, let me ask Brett Weinstein. They were like, oh, no. But I met him anyways. And so I knew of you, in that capacity. But in recent years, what is your goal? What are you trying to do here? And how did you start trying to do that?
Wow, what is my goal? What am I trying to accomplish? That's a big question. I think it's going to be multivariate, the answer. So I'll say I will go back actually just a tiny bit farther into history than you started and say, at the point that Brett, my husband, and I were happily, lovingly teaching at Evergreen, being professors with students whom we adored in an experimental educational model that we adored. But we're definitely beginning to see the cracks around the edges and, occasional really loud cracks on the ice we were standing on and going like, oh, what is happening here? We were also thinking, okay, we really love being able to basically spread the ability to think evolutionarily to people who would not otherwise have access to it. And we were, I think, wildly successful, both of us individually and also together when we taught together, but scaling issues being what they are and just the particular student-faculty ratio being what it was at Evergreen, that meant reaching 25, sometimes 50 at the top 75 students at a time. And that was amazing. And I still know many of those students, but even back before the public blow up that catapulted Brett and then me sort of into the public eye, we were trying to figure out, like, how can we do this more broadly? Is there a way to get the evolutionary word out in the modern era? Is it possible to do something like frankly, like Dawkins did with the selfish gene in 1976, but modernized both for our new understandings and also for the new world in which we live, the media in which we live. So we weren't, although I had imagined, I'll probably be a professor until the end of my career, we were also trying to reach out into the world and see what we could do. So all of that said, at the point that COVID hit, I at least, and Brett, didn't see what came coming. And I think it's a very, very rare person who saw what actually came coming in advance. And we thought, oh, okay, well, there's a lot of chaotic, confusing, internally inconsistent information coming out of these public health agencies, many of which I had a sort of an informal relationship with. Like I had consulted the CDC often throughout my graduate work when I was traveling to places with, it's got this species of malaria, but not that, which kind of prophylaxis should I be on, which of these vaccines should I take, et cetera. And so, I felt like, oh, I actually know something both about the public health side of this apparatus and also about the academic side for sure, having worked, for instance, at an academic grants office before I went to grad school and knowing just how much perverse incentives there are in academic funding and scientific funding. But most of the point, we had the ability to look at the suddenly just plethora of papers that were coming out, being just uploaded to the preprint servers all the time, and begin to try to make sense of what was happening and try to do so in a compelling way that would enable people to then go and do the same thing for themselves. We weren't expecting everyone who listened to us to go onto the preprint servers, but one of the wonders of the preprint servers, unlike Elsevier behind with all the papers behind a paywall, was it's all available if you want it. And one of the things that I ended up feeling was truly important for me as a professor was empowering students to recognize, even students, especially students maybe, without the class privilege that lands people on the footsteps of Harvard and Stanford. Many of the students who we had really no background at all. Like effectively they hadn't had educations because the public school system had failed them so badly. And so their assumption, many of them, when I would drop them into the primary literature, was if I don't understand it, it's because I'm not smart enough.
Mm-hmm.
And what I would often, I think, successfully teach them was maybe, very occasionally, more often, it's that you don't have enough of the background information to interpret what you're reading, but also, and this is the thing that they didn't see coming at all, sometimes you're not understanding it because it's been written in such a way so as not to be understood. And maybe that was sometimes intentionally, sometimes the author doesn't want to be understood because he or she is kind of obscuring something, sometimes because they literally don't know themselves what they're doing. And so treating the literature as this authority that if you don't understand it, that's a problem with you, was something that I worked hard to reverse as a meme in the brains of my students. And so I think that actually was informing a lot of what I was thinking, and I suspect Brett as well, as we began doing these live streams with Dark Horse early in COVID. It's like, no, if you are having this sort of spidey sense that you're getting inconsistent information from the authorities, I'm not telling you, therefore distrust all authorities. What I'm telling you is trust your instincts enough to chase down why they're making the claims that they're making, and then try to go back to first principles as much as possible. And from the very beginning with COVID, we were being told by the so-called experts, no, don't do that. Think not for yourself. Trust us. We got this. And they didn't, right? They clearly didn't.
Right. Well, and I think it's so nice to hear you say that, because I think what you just said, I don't think people realize that's what your goal is. Maybe, because I think people either love you guys for that, or they vilified you as criminals almost who have, taken trust away from science. And I've heard both sides of this. And before you came on, I was asking my following, what kind of questions would you want me to ask? And they had a lot of opinions, because I have a very weird following. I have like very conservative people, libertarian people. I have Marxists. It's weird. And I think it's the key element is people who are critically rational And I appreciate that about them. So from the left, the argument and the question for you was, how could you be okay with putting out misinformation? If you're wrong about something, if you speculate about something and you're wrong about it, because you guys are very critical of things that come out. And I have heard you, make corrections at the beginning of your podcast as much as I think you can. But this is a pervasive environment we're in where it's like, you can't be wrong. You're not allowed to be wrong. You cannot actually conjecture. You have to follow the prescribed path. So to hear you be wrong, even if you are, I'm like, I don't know, I'm rooting for you because more people need to be.
And I think the idea that this is not the moment where you can risk being wrong is at the heart of so many of the errors that we're making societally.
Yep.
It presumes that someone actually already has access to the whole truth, the complete truth, the absolute truth. And even if we presume that everyone is actually acting in good faith for the best interests of everyone, which we know is not true, but even if we presume that, this is a changing environment. Even if it's just that the virus is evolving, which it is, which it will continue to do, what we currently think is true is not necessarily true. This is, frankly, a facile error that, again, was one that I used to work on with my students. And, again, I loved an environment in which I knew my students well enough that I could tell them, no, that's not an accurate portrayal of how it is that we do science. Here's why. And they never mistook that for, and I think you're a bad person. It was never that, right? It was, hey, we're in a relationship in which I'm here with a background to hopefully inform you of how it is, to reveal to you through example and also through reading and all discussion and all of this, but also just through you watching me wrestle with ideas and sometimes come back to you, the students, and now the audience, and say, that thing that we talked about, that wasn't right. Here's how I know, here's how I found out. And sometimes it's someone told me and now I see where my logic was wrong. And sometimes it is, everything that I was basing that on, it turns out, was hinging on an assumption that I had wrong. And that's, that's why I refer to trying to go back to first principles as much as possible. So if the people who are trying to make a go of it, like make sense of their world, aren't allowed to think for themselves, and they're only allowed to take as God's honest truth, the stuff that we're getting from on high, from the people who declare themselves science, but that's not how science works, then we have no ability to think for ourselves, right? And at this point, I think everyone can acknowledge that what we are being told by the CDC, by the WHO, by the various governments, everything from municipal to regional to state and provincial to federal, to the various granting agencies, some of the scientists involved in some of the research that almost certainly produced the work that ended up, releasing this virus on the world. Why are those guys the arbiters of truth? And by the way, that's not how that works. Like, if they really did know all of the things, then they were lying to us about other stuff, because there's no way for them to have known what they claimed to have known at the time that they knew it. And, this is one of the objections to the vaccine rollout, right? I really wish that the mRNA vaccines were safe and effective. What we know for sure is that at the point that they told us these are safe and effective, they couldn't have known that. Right. Therefore, you have to take it on yourself and say, well, okay, then. They are not telling me the truth. I don't know why they're not telling me the truth. I don't know if they don't know they're not telling me the truth, but they're not. So I need to figure out what I can in order to make my own decision.
Well, I think it's because this really isn't about science at this point. And that's where I stepped out of the COVID stuff. I mean, honestly, I did. I stepped away from it. As soon as I made a comment about a lab leak hypothesis that logically, makes sense, I had scientists from all over just basically doing everything that they do to you. Don't be talking to her. Do not associate with this person. And I found that to be scarier than being wrong about the lab leak. I'm like, I'd rather be wrong about this than tell someone not to pursue it. That's the scariest thing of all, is taking science on authority.
It's the end of science.
It's the end of science. And I think that's why, right, wrong, or indifferent, Even if the worst critics are right about you, I'm still on your side because we have to have science. That's the only way we understand what's going on in this world. Otherwise, everything falls apart.
It's the best system we've got, and it's inelegant,
Right.
and it inherently leads to wrong turns and dead ends,
It
and you
has
have to
to.
backtrack.
Hmm.
And what we see from those who are speaking on behalf of science and tell us to follow that science, but not actual science, is a refusal to acknowledge mistakes, to say, that thing wasn't right. Therefore, we're going to go back to base. We're going to go back to the last place in this, decision tree it forked and say, what was the assumption that caused us to go down that route? So that going forward, it's always about the future, right? Like going forward, how is it that we can have the greatest chance of not making those mistakes in the future?
Hmm.
And,
Hmm.
if you don't, in a world of incomplete information, which we always will have, how is it that you can balance, yourself and the collective risks and benefits of the various choices you're making? The answer is not going to be take someone's word as if it is that of God. Like that is what the scientific revolution, the scientific worldview, if you will, and it's not exactly a worldview, but that is supposed to be a rejoinder to a religious worldview, right? And one thing that I recently was considering is it's fascinating to me that Dark Horse has a considerable religious audience. People who
Hmm.
sort of put up with our non-believing nature, our secular nature, our explicitly evolutionary take on absolutely everything. And I think somehow, and I don't know exactly how we get here, but I think somehow many among the religious have sort of taken something on faith at base that I don't, right? And that, generally those in science don't, although it's not entirely the case. But then that frees them to say, okay, now what? Like my authority is not the people in the government. My authority is this other authority over here, and that has freed me. And I think it feels wildly dangerous, frankly, to the other, I insist on calling them pseudo liberals, secularists among the scientists, to have, frankly, actual scientists doing actual scientific thinking and say, yeah, I actually am not responding to any authority. It's not that
Hmm.
I reject you, but I accept you. It's that that's not the basis on which I try to understand the world, not by being told what to think.
Right. Yeah, I think the Christian connection is really interesting as well. And I've noticed this. I just tweeted about it today about Hillsdale College.
Right.
And it's funny because I thought UATX was going to be the new beacon, but something about the secular nature, probably of UATX, pushes it in another direction. I'd love to talk to you about this, but I've noticed Hillsdale, a strange alliance with them. I went to Jay Bhattacharya's talk here in Nashville, and they were very interested in talking with me because we have a common enemy, I suppose, and that common enemy is the authority of science. We don't accept capital S science as an authority. We accept
Mm.
experimentation as the arbiter of truth, and they accept God as the arbiter of truth. Either
Mhm.
way, this, techno-fascist entity that we're entering into, we can both agree that we don't want it. And so I think there's an interesting partnership happening with conservatives and scientists who are still interested in falsification.
Mhm.
Yeah, so tell me about UATX and what you think about Hillsdale and
Yeah, I don't know very much about Hillsdale, but it's consistent with what you've just said. That it
mhm,
seems like a promising, and if you were to have described it to me 10 years ago, I would have said surprising,
mhm,
beacon haven of free thought and free speech. I no longer find it that surprising for exactly
right.
the reasons we've just talked about. UATX, University of Austin, was, gosh, it was the brainchild of just a few people just a few years ago. And there were 6 of us in a day-long conversation in Austin in, it's going to be 2021. And I am so hopeful that it actually does what it's trying to do. It wants to be an elite institution of higher ed that escapes many of the problems of modern higher education. I have, and so I was on the board of trustees. I was one of the founding trustees from that initial conversation, And I have a great respect for all of the people still involved. I don't know all of them still involved, but all the trustees and the others who I know still there. But I resigned from my position and from my affiliation with it at the end of 2022 and posted my resignation letter, as I told them I would, onto my Substack, so it's publicly available. And it was two broad issues that I was having with it, which were pedagogical on one hand, its relationship with science on the other. And I think, as I said, either in my letter or in the preamble to my letter that I posted, it was it was joked about in that initial meeting that I was the token liberal in attendance, and that didn't actually seem to matter, right? But what did end up mattering was that I seemed to have been the token scientist, and there was just not an understanding of science and sufficient among the other people involved to consistently and persistently empower it and raise it to the level that it needs to be at if you're going to create a liberal arts and sciences institution in the 21st century. And it wasn't antipathy towards science. It was sort of a neutral stance that didn't understand it. And that it's exactly the same conflation, frankly, that many, that the coastal elites who listen to NPR and watch CNN and read the New York Times, and boy, was I among those, right? Until, I would have identified as one of those people until very recently. It's the same conflation that they're making during COVID as I think many of the people affiliated with the University of Austin are, which is that, well, to do science, you need big grants, you need a lot of instrumentation, you need, grants administrators, like, we're not going to do that. And I would say, that's fine. Let's do small s science. Like, let's do the science that you can do by going outside. That's the kind of science I do anyway. Like, let's teach undergraduates how to actually think scientifically and how to see pattern, discover pattern, interpret pattern, hypothesize what that pattern might mean, figure out what the experiment or the set of careful observations might be to determine if that hypothesis is falsifiable. And if you can falsify it, teach them the analytics, teach them the stats if that's what you need to do, teach them whatever else you will need to do to analyze it, teach them how to do literature review, teach them how to prepare talks and give good talks, teach them how to write good papers. And I did that as a professor at a, very non-elite institution for students who had, not all of them, but many of them had, just none of the privileges that you would expect. It is possible. And I did it
Hmm.
without big budgets at all. And
Hmm.
I kept pushing for this. And in the moment, it would seem like, yes, that's important. But then sort of out of sight, out of mind, as the sole voice pushing for actual science, it got disappeared. And so similarly, on the pedagogical front, which pedagogy is one of these words that if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I would have said I will never use that word. But with regard with regard to, like, how is it that you teach? Like, what is the teaching environment, the educational structure, the curricular environment? What we had going on at Evergreen was amazing in a lot of ways, and it was super broken in other ways and gameable, obviously. But being able to spend time in depth with students so that you really got to know them, and so that by week 3, you'd broken bread together and sat around a campfire, and now you were back in the classroom or the lab or doing field work or whatever, but it was back on campus. But you knew everyone enough that, and I already made reference to this, when there was disagreement, when they got something wrong, or when I got something wrong, we had enough trust already built to be
Yep.
able to say, nope, here's why. Or I don't think so, maybe, but how did you get there? And instead of feeling, back on their heels, like, oh God, why is she asking me how I got here? They could say, oh, okay, this is about an honest and scientific exploration of what is true. Let's try to figure it
Right.
out. That's our goal here. So the curricular structure put in place at University of Austin was too standard to allow that. And
Hmm.
again, in conversations, I was never told, no, we won't do that. It just never happened. And so it felt like there was too much push, frankly. And again, I think I've said this. The focus was on scraping the woke off the top, right? Like getting
Right.
rid of the very modern diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff that is a problem for sure. And it's getting in the way of free inquiry and free speech and all of that, but it's not sufficient. It's not going to be sufficient to create an actually terrific, like really fantastic modern university.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I loved what you wrote about it, and actually, that was when I first emailed you, I think, and I was like, no, I need
Mm,
to know. I need to know why, because I
yeah.
think that was before I even realized what Hillsdale was up to, and I had such hopes for UATX, and I think I agree with you on the way we need to be teaching people stuff. It's not sexy though. It's not like you said, big grant money. It doesn't have that appeal. It's kind of teaching. It's kind of like a weakest link approach to say like we want to bring everybody from the bottom up to have better
Yeah.
scientific understanding. And
Yep.
I think it's grounded in this. It's an elitist kind of a nature. It's a Hobbesian nature, I think, too, to believe that people are not really capable and they're, I mean, and they are. I've been teaching people philosophy. I've been not even teaching. I literally, I started reading The Structure of Scientific Revolutions on TikTok to people at my, like over lunch, because I wanted to read the book. And I'm like, oh, it's dry. Let me read it aloud. And I have like
That's
a little
great.
following on TikTok that wants
Ugh,
to learn philosophy of science. And and we're learning it together. And there's no, I'm holier than thou. I'm more well read than thou. And I think that's the only way to do it is really to kind of be in the trenches with people and to risk being wrong and
mhm.
say, well, I don't know what they mean by that, or I don't know if I agree with that. And then later, like you say with what you do, is you kind of come back and go, you know what, I used to think that. And then I read something else, or I actually considered this new perspective. But in this snapshot world that we live in, where they want these little bites fed to you, all the
Mhm.
bites have to be correct and all the bites have to be amplifiable. And I don't see that working for the modern institution, and I don't see it working in general. And I'm going to throw something out there and I wonder what you think about this, but I started this podcast because I don't think that kind of education is going to be possible at the university level any longer.
I unfortunately am coming to this perspective, and it is, it makes me very sad. It makes me
I
very,
know,
very sad. I have,
devastating.
I loved, I loved academia in many ways. And it was already at the point that I finished my PhD in 2001. My advisor and one of the other people on my committee sort of sat me down and said, you know, this is not the world that and they were both close to retirement. So they were, they were old guys already. This is not the world that I went into in academia. And you might want to seriously consider, like, you're totally capable, but this may not be the thing that you want to do because there's less and less agency for faculty now, and to the degree that if you want to spend time teaching, and I didn't at that point think that I did, but if you want to spend time teaching, increasingly that's devalued, and so you don't really get to have relationships with students, and so what's the value there? And I, unfortunately, I think they were prescient, and things have gone off the rails in many ways that I don't think anyone saw all of it. One thing you said, I wanted to say, I think if I had not taught at Evergreen for 16 years, 15 years, whatever it was, I would have just continued on with my sort of thought, which is the kinds of things I hear from people, which is that, yeah, most people just can't do it. I was kind of a misanthrope. Like, I really just didn't think very
Mhm.
highly of most people. And I far preferred to go spend time alone in nature. I mean, I still do, but it was in part because I rejected humanity, largely because I had not seen that much to impress me. And my students at Evergreen cured me of my misanthropy, or at least I thought they had cured me, and I feel like it's creeping back now. But my teaching at Evergreen, I realized, like, just maybe 2 years in, 3 years in, it's like, wait a minute. I actually am interacting with my students. I wouldn't know how to walk into a classroom, especially as intimate as these classrooms are. If you're teaching alone, it's 25 students. You have them for many, many, many hours a week. They're full-time programs for 10 weeks or 2 quarters or the entire academic year. So you really know them well. And if I walked in there and right away had in my head, like, well, half these kids aren't going to be able to do anything. I don't know. I just don't know how I would do it. Like, when I'm interacting with a room of 25 people and I'm looking at them and I'm looking into all of their eyes, I have to assume that I know that they're all real human beings, which is not something that many faculty assume of their students. But I also just have to assume, you know what, you're here for some reason that brought you here. You want to be here, and let's see what you can do with it. Like, let's see how I can help you make the most out of this situation. And it was the very rare student, like actually very rare student, about whom I felt like, I think that was a waste of time for both of us. Like, I just don't
Mm.
think we got anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not claiming that everyone got to the same place. I'm not saying that everyone is equally capable. Like, that is not at all my claim, but I do feel like people on the right, conservatives will hear what I'm saying and say, "Oh, this sounds socialist." And, people on the left will say, "No, everyone's equally capable." Like, neither of these things is right, right? Like,
Right.
actually, you can reach almost everyone if you actually try to know what you know well enough to be able to communicate it clearly, and then give them the tools with which to discover things of their own, as opposed to keep the tools to yourself because you kind of like the power of only being able to dribble out bits and pieces, which unfortunately I
Mm-hmm.
think is part of what is going on with a lot of teaching. So will it be possible to keep doing that in higher ed? Not with the current models. I don't think so, unfortunately. I think you're right.
Well, and students seem like such a burden to professors I mean, I don't know about in your field, but in
Yes.
mine, I don't know what classes you taught, but it did seem like we were a burden to a lot of these people. And then there was a few when I went to undergrad, they were like, "Oh, be a doctor. You're smart. You're second in your class. Be a doctor." I'm like, "Oh, okay. I like cutting stuff up." So I started, I started in like Bio 101, and I had a professor who studied Cape ground squirrels. And she was like, "I need someone in my lab to help dissect squirrel poop." And I was like, what? Yes, can I do that? And we were looking for hormones in the squirrel poop. And I had a few really great professors that were so enamored with their research, communicating that with students, that I thought, I don't want to be this kind of professor. This is really something. And what I didn't see was behind that, the R1, let's call it a spider web, I guess, because I don't even know what else it is, but that they get stuck in, that they're fighting against, and all their passion kind of gets sucked away. And not only that, but I think the other thing that's killing this kind of instruction is the careerism of not only the
Mhm.
professors but the students, that I have to learn this because X, Y, and Z. I need to read Atomic Habits so I can
Mm.
optimize. And it's like, how do I explain why you need to learn philosophy? I don't know how to
Yeah.
tangibilize that for people. And I think doing so causes a problem. Like, we should not be necessarily trying to turn everything into concrete bullet points that you can just gobble up. They're meant to be savored. So that's going to
Yeah.
require people wanting to do it on their own and outside of a place where they pay thousands of dollars to get a check mark.
I agree with everything you just said. And I think, what remarkable actually, but yeah, I agree with everything you just said. And one of the things it just reinforces for me is my loathing for applying metrics to everything. Imagining, and this again is a misunderstanding of science, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some science, the science that is most easily communicated to a public that doesn't think they can do science or doesn't have the time, doesn't want to, whatever, involves reductionism and
Mm-hmm.
making metrics out of the things that you've reduced. Okay, let's see this complex system. What can I measure? I'm going to measure that, and then I'm going to make a graph that's kind of appealing visually. I'm going to trot that out to the public without ever questioning, is the thing that was most easily measured the right thing to measure about the system? Like, what is the truth that you know about the system? It may well not be the thing that you measured. And there's exactly zero reason philosophically, I would think, to imagine that the thing that is most easily measured about a system is the most important thing about a system. Like that actually, I think, is almost axiomatic in the modern scientific paradigm. If you can measure it
Right.
easily, then it must be the thing we should be talking about. No, not necessarily at all.
Right.
And so, one of the words that I specifically use with my students on my study abroad programs, where I never did study abroad with students I didn't know. I'd always already spent 10 to 15 weeks domestically with them on a couple of domestic field trips and in the classroom. But I crafted these things very, very carefully. I architected them, unfortunately sometimes when you're going to places deep in Ecuador or Panama, the joke but this happened once. Like I actually had to know exactly where 26 people were going to be having lunch 18 months in advance, right? Like it was that level of planning. But I did that so that we would definitely have a place to sleep every night, right? And so that I could get us into these deep field stations in remote nature. I did that specifically so that the framing, so that the architecture I knew and therefore they knew was robust. And so within that, there was maximal freedom for, and here's the word that I love maybe most, serendipity, right? So I don't know what we're going to find. I don't know what we're going to discover. That's the wonder of it. If I already knew, yeah, maybe I still want to go see one of the 10 species of monkeys or all of the 10 species of monkeys at Tipitini in the eastern Ecuador in the most biodiverse spot on Earth in the Amazon. But it's not about checking it off a list. It's how do you discover how to find those monkeys? How do you discover how to find one of the 5 species of cats, right? Or maybe your interest once you get there is actually, I'm super focused on the macro, and I've had students like this. Like they thought they were going to be into the charismatic megafauna because we all kind of are, but they would just be focused on these little tiny plants that you actually needed to get out your hand lens to see into, and just like the fractal nature of the complexity in these plants in the Amazon is extraordinary, and not just the Amazon, the Paramo, the scablands of Washington, the San Juan Islands, where I also took students and where I now live, like, and in your own backyard, right? Like the discovery that you can make, the discoveries that you can make if you slow down and say, actually, this part isn't scheduled. This isn't, no, it's not at 9:10. We need to be doing this next thing. There's going to be time for that. Like we're going to have lectures. I'm going to teach you statistics. Like we're going to do some of that, but we have to leave some time and preferably a lot of time for, I don't know what's going to happen now. But unless you sit there with a bag of chips and a remote in your hand or, screen or whatever, wasting all of that time, if you go out into the world and actually expose yourself to something you haven't exposed yourself to before, you'll discover something new. And then you start
Yeah.
applying scientific thinking and the evolutionary lens to what you're seeing, and voila, so thus you are educated. Like that's part of the process of how it happens. And it can't be done by scheduling everything and doing everything with bullet points, just as you said.
No, I mean, and the things that I remember from those magical undergrad moments were, I got chills when you're talking about it because I feel that feeling that I felt, and it's such a rare feeling. But you're absolutely right. I remember the funny moments when things happened that were completely unexpected. Like we had a cadaver that I was dissecting in grad school. We had so many problems with her. Unfortunately, the poor thing, she died of diabetes, but she had a stent. She was missing a leg. It looked like she had vitiligo. And we found a bullet in her. It was just, but these are things that I'm not even kidding. And then we did a research project where I counted the branches of the vagus nerve in all the cadavers. And that was the worst part of it, was checking off all the boxes, the discovery, in a sense, the questioning, the asking, the difficulties. Those were all the parts in everything I've ever learned that I remember and create something that Adam Mastriani, he writes experimental history. I don't know if you read it or not, but he calls the vibe of your educational experience. And
Yeah.
I feel the vibe.
I mean, the thing that I taught sometimes, so the 2 large branches of things that I taught, and I did other things as well, were animal behavior, which is broadly like microevolutionary understanding of why organisms are doing what they do, and then vertebrate evolution, which is the macroevolution, the systematics, the phylogeny. And because until the molecular revolution, as you well know, at this point, most phylogenetic reconstructions are being done with molecular data, but it was always morphological data until then. And so you've got sort of this development and anatomy as the ways in to infer history. And so I used to teach comparative anatomy labs as part of my vertebrate evolution syllabus, because again, these were full-time programs. And so if I'm teaching 16 credits worth of material to students every single quarter, but it's all the same students, right? I'm going to have computer labs to teach them how to what a good character set, what a good data set looks like, and how to then infer history depending on various assumptions that you do or don't make. And I'm also going to teach them the theory, and I'm also going to teach them comparative anatomy labs, as it turns out, because that was a way into the morphology. And at first, I was mostly inheriting what I had learned from when I taught that in graduate school. And I never actually took anatomy. I learned it through teaching it in grad school because it was one of the things I was assigned to do, and I liked it enough. But it was very rote, as you say, right? Like, okay, how many branches? Like, okay, what are the 12 cranial nerves? Like, okay, let's just go through it. And I didn't care much. And, as you might imagine, given that I was super enthusiastic about and knew my students really well, most of what I was teaching, at the point that I got to stuff that I'm teaching them, I don't really care. And most of them are not going to become doctors. And we're doing sharks and cats too. So even if they are going to become doctors, they're not going to run into another shark or cat. And you don't need to know exactly what's going on there. So with the exception of like my one or two students a year, maybe who were like pre-vet, like this was not going to be directly applicable to what they were doing. It was much more about like, how do we think about this? Like, what is the philosophy of what we are doing? And so the kinds of questions, like, yes, I did lab practicals, and yes, it was most of the students' least favorite part and kind of mine too. But the questions that I would ask them would not just be like, okay, name this muscle and tell me the homology in a shark. Like, name this muscle in the cat that's pinned and tell me the homology in a shark. But also, in another mammal. So if I've got a muscle in a cat and, if we know the origin and insertion point, in another mammal, is that muscle going to have the same origin and insertion point? Yes, 100%. Okay, here's an artery. Is this going to have exactly the same starting and end point in another mammal or even just another individual within the same species? Not necessarily. Okay, why? Like, why do muscles not vary nearly as much? They'll vary in size, but not in precision about where they're attached, whereas the cardiovascular system has all of this flexibility in it. So let's talk about that. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's how I managed to try to make the comparative anatomy stuff a little bit more alive. Like, oh, as long as it gets where it needs to go, if you're a neuron or a vessel, you can get there. But a muscle doesn't work if it's not attached at exactly where it needs to be attached. So, those were the sorts of queries that I tried to have bubbling up as we had, 3, 4 hours of labs in any given section where you're just like, you're bent over a kind of smelly organism and you've got a scalpel and your lab partner maybe can't be working at the same time. And you're like, God, what do I talk about? Am I just going to like quiz her on the names of these vessels or the names of these muscles? Like, no, let's talk about what you're looking at. Like,
Mm-hmm.
why are we doing sharks and cats or sometimes salamanders? Like, why those? Why, why doesn't, say, a turtle make as good a model organism for understanding comparative vertebrate anatomy? So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I could go on about that forever. Maybe I should stop.
No, I love it. I mean, I think this is the kind of stuff that it's really hard to convince people to be curious about it. It's really
Right.
hard to tell them like if it's not already there that this is absolutely fascinating. If you open it up and they don't go, "Whoa, interesting. What is that?" If they don't have those thoughts primed, if they're already going, "Okay, checkbox, I got to get this, I got to get that done." It takes effort to open it for them a little bit and you have to relate it to them in some way, and that's not conducive to check boxes.
It's not. And they feel like they're falling behind.
Yeah, then there's this like got to play catch up thing, and you do have to have a solid rote knowledge to be able to make these kinds of questions. There has to be a solid base understanding, but that the base understanding is not the rationale for getting it. The rationale for getting it is to apply it. What do we do with this? What is the possibility here? And
Yes.
it wasn't for me in my own career until I slowed down, even I left academia, I left the pharmaceutical industry even, and I said, "Whoa, there's so much interesting stuff around me." Like I said, I started reading philosophy of science, and I had been a scientist for a decade and never thought to question, the normal puzzle solving activities of science, because I had in my head the only way to be a scientist is to be at an R1 university, and if I'm not there, I've failed. And I think my question for you with all of this being said is what would you recommend to Heather now, if Heather was coming up, getting her PhD today, what would you tell her to do?
Boy, I do not know. I don't know. Like I loved school and I was a good student and it was easy for me. But I don't know if even I could put up with a graduate education right now, given how broken it is. We've talked about sort of the brokenness over on like the business model side of it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and then most of the mentors now, the old school guys who I learned from are retired now. And that's not to say that there aren't. I assume that there are many, many amazing scientists still working in
Mm-hmm.
academia, but it's harder and harder for them. And there's this selective process wherein they're getting funneled into narrower and narrower fields, more highly specialized, conforming to whatever the university says they should do, and then add to that, the woke stuff, the diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff, where we're not supposed to be paying most attention to what we think is true. We're supposed to be paying most attention to immutable characteristics of the people doing it. And I don't know how much discovery and joy and serendipity can happen in that environment. The market forces will want to take away the serendipity. Like, well, can you justify that time you're spending? No, actually not yet, and maybe never. And I know it's not my job to do that. I don't have to justify that. And that was, certainly because I did my graduate work, I did my actual field work in very remote places, like literally on an island off the coast of Madagascar, mostly, before the era of cell phones. And I had a sat phone that never worked. And so, I was showering in a waterfall and living in a tent and discovering every day new things about these poison frogs
Sounds
that no one
awful.
else had looked at. It was amazing. I mean, it was hard, right? Like it was actually,
Of course.
extraordinarily challenging in some ways, but it was also, there were no encroachments. And another benefit of that, actually, of having this very, very remote set of field sites, that the one that I just described was the one that I spent the most time at, was that very remote field sites in an era before, I mean, I guess this would apply even now, but an era before there was a lot of communication, a bunch of telecoms, this is 1990s, was that when I got on the plane to Madagascar to go with my giant trunks, and I built a solar electricity system so I could power a laptop so I could enter data and write, and I mean, I literally had to pack all the toilet paper I would need for the entire field season. Like it was that level of like, you got to be super prepared. But whatever I didn't have, I didn't have. So
Right.
I was doing water chemistry, among other things, on the little wells in which my frogs were living and reproducing. And in one of my early field seasons, my pH meter broke, and I happened to have brought along pH strips. I'm like, well, oh, these are fine. Okay, from now on, I don't rely on fancy things with corrodable contacts in the jungle. I'm going to bring pH paper that I can keep totally dry by keeping in a dry bag with desiccant. And so you learn to be completely self-sufficient. And then the reason I'm talking about this is that the advantage on the other side is once you get back on the plane, back to the US, Michigan, in the case of where I was in grad school, the data's collected. Like I got what I got. I haven't analyzed it all yet by any means, but the data are in my field books, and to the degree that I was able to, in the laptop, to
You
the
couldn't
degree that
p
I already.
hack it.
So, there's no possibility, right? Like it's just like it is what it is. And so if someone says to me, well, did you need to go back and do X, like no, I can't. Like I'm not in Madagascar now. So the corralling of the either, and as it turns out, I did do a good job. But if I hadn't, oh well, then you're gonna have to spend a whole nother field season. Oh,
Mhm.
oh, well, that's a really big burden. I better get it right then. And I think
Mhm.
the sense of, oh, I'm just at school, I'm just doing research, and yeah, I want it to only take 5 years or 6 years or 7 years or whatever, but I can always just spend more time. It allows people to think, well, I have endless time. I could just keep going. And so there's a real value in having a research place that is far removed. And when you're there, and that's what you're doing. Like you don't have any excuse.
Mhm.
Like if you don't spend absolutely every day collecting data and generating new hypotheses and and working on your research, what are you doing? That's not you being a good scientist. And then when you're back, no, I'm not collecting data today because I'm not actually in Madagascar. So there are,
Yeah, you're making me want to do field work.
it is, yeah, it's totally different, right? Like what are the advantages and disadvantages of lab versus field work, right? You
Mhm.
cannot control, when the typhoon came in, when the giant tropical storm came in, and my field assistant and I had to head into the hills, into the cave where the the ancient Malagasy had been buried. Like, okay, this is where we just have to spend a little bit of time because the frogs, we hope they're going to be okay, but there's just no being down near the coast right now. And that usually doesn't happen in a lab. On the other hand, if I wanted to know something very, very precise and control for weather and temperature and and things like, for instance, the water chemistry I mentioned at the wells, like, oh, I want to see if I actually raise the pH a bit, if these guys are still going to survive. Well, I can't really do that while I'm living in the jungle, living in a tent in Madagascar. Like, there are questions that are just beyond what you can do in the field, and that's some of why lab work is valuable and can answer questions that field work can't.
Well, I think what you're touching on is like variety rather than this kind of, I don't want to call it a scientific monoculture, but that's the only thing I can think of that's
Yeah.
happening. And I was listening to one of your episodes of Dark Horse where you guys were talking about that compound appealed, the diglyceride stuff they're putting on stuff now. Once, and this is a little Ted Kaczynski of me, but it's like once we
Mhm.
cross over this threshold, there's no going back. You have to have a car now. I mean, you can't really go back to the time when we didn't have satellites and you couldn't have called somebody to get something, or, there's something this like, the rising tide that brings up all ships. It kind of sucks because you can't really go back to whatever that was. We have to like do everything while the tide is low. And I don't really know how to get around that except to say that the principle of biodiversity, I think, is a consilience idea. This is why we consider ourselves liberals, because we do believe and value true diversity. And I think that's applicable to everything. When I think about funding sources, when I think about types of education, when I think about types of scientific research, a diverse smattering of things that can be done is better than a monoculture.
Absolutely.
I mean, maybe you wouldn't tell young Heather to go start a podcast because she would be like me and not, have some media storm behind her. Not yet. I haven't come up with one yet. Um, maybe you wouldn't tell her to do that because she'd be, kind of starting at a disadvantage. But you might tell her to just do what she loves and kind of let it follow, that I don't know, because I mean, isn't that what you've done all along?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, at some level, exactly right. When I was very little, there were a few other things that I thought I was going to be, not entirely emerging from my passion. Like, I trained as a classical pianist for many, many years, and I feel like the classical music training kind of broke me in a lot of ways, but boy, did it help me develop habit. I mean, I got up every morning at 5:30 to practice for an hour before school, and I practiced for an hour after school for most of my childhood. And then I was 14 at the point that I said to my parents, this is not what I'm going to do. Like, this is not my life. And I was having to make these decisions that weren't really mine, where I was being told, well, you can't go play sports because you might damage your precious hands. And I was like, I actually think I value sports more than I value my precious hands with regard to never risking breaking a finger. But I loved the music theory, and I loved the math and the music theory. And my dad was a mathematician. Yeah, she was a computer scientist. So he started taking me to math competitions, and I was like, maybe I'll do that. But the thing that really came early, and that I think has been the thread throughout all of it, was my love of words. So I wanted to be a writer from a fairly young age, and specifically began college wanting to be a science fiction writer, and found in the study of literature too much emphasis, honestly, even this would have been the late 80s, too much emphasis on the personality of the author and on bits of the story that didn't matter to me. Like, I wanted to tell true stories, and I came to understand how important it was to actually have lived an interesting enough life that you had stories to tell. And so, went into science, where I had always loved watching animals, and had been, as used to be all young people were looking for meaning, right? I've been looking for meaning. Had sort of dabbled in Buddhism, had been trying to figure out what made sense of it all. And it was a Dawkins book, actually, that Brett gave me right as we were beginning to date halfway through college, that sort of opened it up for me. And yeah, from each of these choices has been not a eye on the prize, like I'm going to become a X in the future, but does this feel like a way forward that is honest and has integrity, and in which both my day-to-day and my lifelong, the differences I will be making are ones that feel valuable both to me and to the planet and to the people who I'm interacting with. So I don't mostly I don't want to be podcasting. And I don't I say this to Brett a lot, like you know that this is not what I want to be doing, right? I want to be alone in nature and writing and sending my words out into the world that way. But it is clear from our audience, from the people who contact us, and from people who stop us on the street, even now, like we've moved to an island now, but especially when we travel and are anywhere with more people, that what we're doing is so valuable to so many people that I keep doing this, even though this is maybe the first time in my life where I find a lot of my day-to-day stuff that isn't exactly what I would choose to be doing. Like, I'd rather be outside. I'd rather be outside.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's difficult to be because you're talking about impact. If you're having an impact, that might be important. And I find it interesting because, I think about Socrates and how we never read anything of Socrates is because he placed so much value on conversation. And
Yeah.
I love your writing, by the way. I was reading your Substack this morning and your story about the male arguments over real estate. And I thought to myself, it's so funny. I have almost everybody that comes on this podcast is a writer in some capacity because I think I am, I mean, I'm a writer as well. And there's something emotional between writers that you get a sense for them. And so I understand your desire to spend time writing and spend time alone. But sometimes I think you do have to do what calls you and what the world needs at times. But I love that you're still making time and effort to do this. And I'm wondering, I was going to ask you if you write fiction because it seems like you might have a propensity for it.
Yeah, literally the year that Evergreen blew up, the last 2 quarters before it blew up, I was on the first sabbatical I ever had because Evergreen had a lot of perks, but the sabbatical and other benefits for faculty, monetary benefits, were not among them. So after 14 years, I got a couple quarters of sabbatical, and I wrote a science fiction novel. And it had been something that I had in mind for a while, and I'd fully drafted it. In fact, I got through the second draft, literally finished the second draft the day that the mob showed up at Brett's door on May 23rd, 2017. And I really want to go back to it. I think it will look dated at this point, but there's a central question. Well, the central question is there other consciousness in the galaxy, and what would we do at the point that we found it? And I'm not going to give away the answer that I write into this book, but what I wanted to do was, and this is something that I began to write into, like, pitch letters again many years ago now. This is dated, but was a lot of science fiction gets the physics right, but very often it gets the biology wrong. Like most
Mm-hmm.
science fiction, I get it when it's in Hollywood, when it's visual media. It's like you got to put a person in an alien suit, and so it's going to be kind of a human model. It's going to be bipedal and fructation and bilateral symmetry and all of this. But boy, there are a lot of ways for life to evolve, even on this planet, even intelligent life on this planet. And so, what are some of the other ways? Especially with a different type of star, with with a slightly different periodicity, it's still going to be in like our Goldilocks zone if we can be there and be interacting with it. But how different might sentient life be that we might miss it? Like how
Right.
different would it have to be before we didn't even recognize that we were among other organisms that were thinking deeply and carefully? And I think we have a
Yeah.
few examples of this here. Like at this point, we feel like, well, we've always known that dolphins and elephants and, wolves are, and parrots and crows are so smart. And like, well, not for very long. And, but
Mhm.
we haven't actually really grokked that for as long as we imagine we have. So, and not to mention cephalopods, like, what is going
Right.
on with octopus and squid? We don't know. We just know that they are incredibly
Yeah.
capable of solving puzzles.
The Arrival was a great film in that respect because they did go a little bit outside of the box, but I think there's still a lot of room for taking our own element out of it and opening our eyes to something a little bit outside of what we might expect. And the only thing that I think might be dated, the only thing I could think of that would be dated between now and then would be what's going on with artificial intelligence.
Huh. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Because that's going to be, if we survive this one, that's going to be, who knows? I
Who
mean, I
knows?
don't even know if I can wager a guess.
Yeah. No, I think that's where I am. It does feel like event horizon, and trying to look like, nope, can't see. I don't know. I
No,
don't know.
no, we're gonna have to get spaghettified, I think. So one thing I wanted to ask you, speaking of getting spaghettified, what do you think is kind of like the best criticism you've received during this time and the
Mm.
worst?
During COVID, during Dark Horse.
I mean,
Is
yeah,
that the
during your
time?
whole,
Yeah.
during Dark Horse, probably.
Yeah. I feel like there are criticisms that could have come that didn't come. The 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 people who were criticizing us were large. In fact, this is something I said on air at some point. I was laughing, but I was also frustrated. And what I said was, we need better skeptics. Like the stuff that's coming at us just doesn't it's
You're
just so,
racist.
yeah, and you're racist, and but even, well, I mean, you mentioned one of these, like, oh, yeah, you're killing people by suggesting people take ivermectin. It's like, just look into what that drug is, even if it was ineffective, which, the evidence is it's not against this virus or many other viruses, but it's not dangerous. Like, it's not that kind of a drug. And so there were just these, like, it was like people took up random strings of words and kind of lobbed them at us. And like, science proceeds through discovery and discussion and disagreement and refinement of your ideas. And Brett and I do that with each other, right? And, both on camera and off. And we would critique each other and figure out where someone was maybe not, going down into the weeds or something. But very little that came across publicly seemed like savvy criticism. And, I'm not remembering, this is a couple years ago, and a lot of water has gone to the bridge by now, but there's certainly, a few things, especially early on, that we got wrong, and we corrected them. And I don't know if those necessarily came from outside, though, or our own discovery. I think, for instance, we were wrong on masks, and we were both masking early here, not here, but in Portland, and did not really understand what the history of the research was. It was one of these things that just seemed like, well, it seems like it would make sense that this is what you do to block transmission of this kind of virus. And the evidence now that I can see suggests that that's probably not the case.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I got a critique in grad school that I think would be relevant here, but I haven't heard it. And maybe I haven't heard it because Brett and I are always here together. I was working with a postdoc. He was writing some code for me so I could run my data through some resampling statistics. And he was not a field guy. I mean, he did some field work, but mostly he was a computer biology scientist. And he was a little bit taken aback by my independence. Like, I was always going off on my own and doing things and coming back with, my own interpretation, my own analysis. Be like, who are your collaborators? You're going to have to start collaborating with people. And I think at that point, I mentioned that I'd been something of a misanthropist. My sense was, I collaborate with people and then they'll do something that's wrong and then I have to fix it. And it's just easier if I do it myself. But I heard him, because I was collaborating with him, and he was like, you see that this is working. Like, you're getting more, like, you don't know how to write this code. Like, we're doing stuff together here that is effective. And, you should find the collaborative partners more. And, I have one in my life partner, right? I have some others, but I think my pretty extreme introversion, like, I love people now, but I need a lot of time away from them. And if there's a lot of other chaos in my life where I'm having to manage, people and systems and finances and, all of this stuff associated with, oh, you're an entrepreneur now. I didn't see that coming. Then I respond by sort of going like, okay, then for the rest of it, for like my creative and analytical and scientific part, I am once again going to revert to being entirely alone. And I think there would be benefits to having more people with whom I am in active conversation about some of what I'm thinking about scientifically, but I often can't bring myself to do it.
I love that. I actually really like that criticism. I think I think it matches up with the only thing I could really come up with as to why people feel so strongly about the things that you say.
Hmm.
And I think it's because you and Brett are kind of, not to psychoanalyze, but you've kind of created this little like shell of yourselves that is protective, and you can bounce scientific ideas off each other. So there is no reason to reach outside. And science is built on refutation. And so if there's no one around to refute your conjecture except the two of you who agree a lot, that is probably the biggest criticism
Well,
you could have.
he doesn't have this problem though. He has different problems. But he doesn't, he doesn't, so he is in conversation with, I would say, too many people, honestly. So it's almost like, so we are sort of at extremes in terms of like the input that we're getting. And it's not that again, I keep on thinking like we need better skeptics. And, someone, Alexandros Marinos, who we didn't know at the time, heard that and said, oh, okay, I'm going to create a better skeptics thing. And I don't remember all the specifics, but he basically set up okay, here's like the 8 episodes that you guys have done or Brett has done with guests that people think have rife with errors. And let's get this panel of neutral judges and, figure out where all the errors were. And, it turns out there were 1 or 2 trivial errors. And the thing is that we are careful and
Right.
we try very hard to distinguish between this is what I strongly believe is true and here's why. And this I think is probably true, but I'm not sure. And I have this hunch, like I kind of think this thing, but I don't even know why. Like I don't know what my evidence is, but just know that I'm thinking about that. And the thing is, we are willing to say all of those things, which
Right.
is, and like I believe that we are actually always very careful about, and I don't think of those as like 3 distinct categories, but like to the degree there's a continuum from, yeah, you know what? I would be shocked if evidence came in suggesting that we are brains in jars or that like evolution is not what explains life on Earth, right? All the way to, I actually kind of think that being barefoot on the Earth, on the place where you are, may help and train circadian rhythms. I think that's true. And I think there's actually a bit of scientific evidence for that. But that is one of these ideas that I have that is beginning to be studied scientifically, but it feels kind of woo and kind of like I just have this sense that I feel better when I do that. And other people do too. But I don't know. I don't know for sure. Right. So there's a big gap between those things. And
Right.
and I think it's, again, a problem. I think that that's a virtue. And that the other thing where you only say things with 100% certainty is the problem.
Which they don't have, by the way.
Which you can't have. So it's pretense. And it makes people come to expect, well, either you're certain or you're not. It's like, no, not either you're certain or you're not. Not at all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. Because I had people asking me, like, I had 2 people ask me to ask you about terrain theory. Well, I asked them specifically, like, what should I ask her about that she said about terrain theory? Like, I don't know. It was just a vibe I got. And I'm like, yeah, because exactly what you said, they'll say stuff, but you miss the caveat in the beginning or at the end. It's like, well, I'm not sure. And people think when you throw that caveat at the beginning or the end, it's a way to say stuff that's inflammatory and still back away from it. But I disagree entirely. I think wherever you throw your caveat in, it should adequately explain how you think and feel about the subject. And we're not comfortable with probabilistic thinking. We're not comfortable hearing people say, I really think this, I'm not sure about that. We are not accustomed to listening for gradations. We want to know, and especially in podcasting, like I said, they want an amplifiable, discrete snippet to turn into a soundbite, like I will do to this one right here. Like,
yeah.
That's what we're looking for.
Boy, so I'll say something about terrain theory in a second, but one of the things that we did with our boys, so we've got a 19 and a 17-year-old, both sons, and the older one, who's also our producer, was definitely like in his head from the very beginning. He was like born 30 years old, and he like definitely had ideas about stuff. And early on, he would say, well, when he was like 8, 10, 12, like, I know that X is true. And we would say, with what degree of certainty? 100%. I don't think so. And so it was this training of like, no, I actually want you, like, and this is an obvious role of a parent with a child, right? Like, no, it's actually important for me to teach you how to understand how certain you are. Because if you really think that certainty is a binary, that is not going to serve you well in the world. And you're not going to be able to make sense of the world because almost never do you have a binary with regard to certainty. And so, yes, you're going to be making these numbers up, but start giving me numbers less than 100% when I ask you how certain you are about something. And boy, that was one of the most useful sort of parenting tricks that we did, I think. Like he had just matured so fast with regard to his ability to make sense of things that were incoming and that he was trying to process and like match with apparently inconsistent things. So yeah, the desire for certainty and the responding to lack of certainty as if, oh, you're just hedging, oh, you're just giving yourself an excuse, oh, you're just covering in order to be inflammatory. This feels to me like, what is the other? Oh, I've been called a contrarian. Like, and I love that I can say I'm not a contrarian because that sounds like obviously I am.
Pretty contrarian.
Right. But like, no, contrarian is knee-jerk negative, knee-jerk rejection. And I don't know what the knee-jerk acceptance thing is, like compliant, faithful, right? It's skeptic, right? It's, okay, once I know you, and once I come to have, seen your thinking over and over and over again for a while, I will be ever less skeptical of anything you say. It's exhausting. Who wants to do that, right? But I reject the idea that anyone who makes an announcement about anything needs to be 100% rejected or 100% accepted without knowing anything else about them. I want to take that in and consider it. So like, how is considering it now the enemy of reason? No, it is reason, right? It's the reality is reversed. With regard to terrain theory, we've been getting these questions on we do these Q&As after our live streams most weeks, and we've been getting questions like, oh, you know that viruses aren't real, you know that it's terrain theory, not germ theory of disease, you know germ theory of disease is a lie. And for a long time I was like, I don't know what these people are on about, but they're wrong. Like this is just ridiculous, and I had never even heard of terrain theory. So I looked into it a little bit, and I see I really don't know much about it, but I see it as understanding a healthy system as being one that is better able to fend off pathogens than one that is not a healthy system.
Right.
And when framed that way, I go like, okay, terrain and germ theory of disease together
work together.
That's what makes sense.
Right.
And then I made the mistake, as I think at this point it's almost always a mistake to go into Wikipedia. Boy, they've right slandered Brett and me for sure, and a lot of other good people. But they have on their site, and I can't remember exactly where I ran into it, but their description of terrain theory is, boy, let's see if I can come up with it. They say something to the effect of, this is the discredited idea that your overall health has anything to do with your ability to fend off disease. And I look at that and I go, how did that sentence get written and not immediately rejected? Like the discredited idea that your health affects whether or not you can fend off disease? Like, do the people who think ridiculous. They're defending, yeah, it doesn't make any sense. And I think, do the people who think they're defending germ theory of disease, which like I'm totally on board that ship, but do the people who think they're defending it against terrain theory really think that your health doesn't matter at all and all you have to do is get, pathogen in, sickness out? Like, we know from every disease ever, COVID included, that different people will react differently to the pathogen. That's a known. Like, that's so basic. So I think that to some degree people are talking at cross purposes. And for a long time, I was just rejecting terrain theory. I was like, no, I want to listen to you. Germ theory of disease is true, so shut up already, right?
Same.
But it's both. I mean, I think I don't know the history of the terrain theory stuff, so I don't know exactly when it came up and how they appear to be at loggerheads, but it feels to me like two true understandings of the universe that clearly interface with one another.
Yeah, and I think the answer here is that, if the same person is coming at you with anti-germ theory, pro-terrain theory, flat earth theory, all these other kind of things, reptilian reptiles running the government or whatever, then it's kind of, it's hard to take anything. And I just kind of shut off, right? I'm like, leave that for Michael Shermer to deal with. But, there's sometimes where you kind of have to look into stuff and go, and I think this is a lot of what you're doing And people are annoyed with it. But honestly, the only way to really move forward in life and have confidence in what you're doing is to evaluate it for yourself. And we're so data centric now
Mm.
that
Yeah.
it's like we look for the answer in data everywhere. And we have a lot of data, but I don't think we have the right frame of mind to challenge because of a lack of scientific training in general.
Mhm.
We don't have the ability to manage this data. It's like we just have these numbers and we don't know what to do with them. And it's a big issue moving forward. And I think, one of the things I think about a lot is like complexity theory. Are you into any of this? Have you been reading up on it at
I
all?
have not been reading up on it recently. I have in the past a bit, but I'm not. It's been a while since I refreshed myself.
I'm fascinated with it because I think we're teetering on a lot of edges in general, but I look at this and I kind of wonder what's going on over there and what part of
Yeah.
this conjecture can we manage? And I think this is the question on everybody's mind is how can we manage the stuff we don't understand yet?
Yeah.
And what can we do with it? And I think this is a great general curiosity and thirst for information,
Mm.
but we're lacking the tools to scale down the edge into the abyss. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And I wonder, you said most people lack scientific understanding or training, something to that effect. And I think that's 100% true. And unfortunately, it's maybe especially true among people with degrees in science. That
I
because,
know.
right? And it's tragic. It is absolutely tragic. And so, you said you've been doing philosophy now. Like you're literally reading Kuhn on TikTok. It's amazing, right? I I was lucky. I think I was predisposed anyway, but my graduate advisor was inherently a philosopher of science. And he was a macroevolution guy. He was a phylogeny guy, deep history guy. And historical science is different from other kinds of science. Like you can't apply statistics. You don't have repeated events. You have events that are like each other, but they're not identical to each other. And so you have to understand the world differently if you're talking about like what are cats and what is all the diversity within cats versus like, oh, there's a cat-like thing that separately evolved over in Australia. What is cat-likeness? Like that is sort of like a
Mhm.
microevolutionary question that allows you like that's at the level of adaptation on microevolution. But if you're doing just the history, it's like, what is the nature of cat? And is it the same as the nature
Mhm.
of gold? It's not. Like a gold atom
Mhm.
is going to be the same everywhere in the universe, whereas a cat will not have evolved anywhere else in the universe, but there may be cat-like forms. And that's fascinating to me, and that was fascinating to him. And so every single program I ever taught, I think, almost every single program I ever taught at Evergreen began with philosophy of science. Like, how is it that we make
Mhm.
claims of truth? What's the epistemological basis for what it is that we're talking about? And if you ever can't find it, you, the students, anyone, then ask. Because I am not
Mhm.
supposed to be up here making claims on the basis of my authority. My degree doesn't make me right. Like, my experience doesn't even make me right. It maybe makes me more likely to be able to see the truth when I stumble across it, or to find the truth because I wasn't stumbling, but because I was focused because of the experience and the knowledge base that I already have. But the piece of paper doesn't prove I'm right. And I don't think
Yeah.
that most people with the relevant pieces of paper actually know that. And that is a big part of why we're in the mess we're in.
For me, I might have found philosophy of science boring before having been a scientist.
Yep.
And well, and the reason why I started reading this on TikTok is because I'm like a lot of these philosophers wrote about physics because during the time period that's what they had. But we've had so many advances in biology that I'm like, what if I just rewrote Kuhn with biological examples? And in my own language, also, thinking about these things are 50, 100, 150, 200 years old now. And people aren't accustomed to reading like that anymore. And so I've kind of started down this little trajectory of reading like that. But I wonder if that would, kind of whet an appetite for it, or if you have to have been in the thick of it to really get the understanding for it. If you had to have really have done all those stupid experiments and been in the cave where
Mhm.
you were, with dealing with the frogs to really appreciate how vital that is. I just don't know.
I think, I don't think it requires years of field work or lab work, right? But I think it certainly benefits greatly from some experience. And so, the thing that I wedded it with when I was teaching was, a week really of philosophy of science, plus almost always in one of the opening days of class in a little thing that I learned actually in a tropical studies course, an organization for tropical studies course in Costa Rica, where called 20 questions. So you take students out into nature as deep as you can get them, depending on where you are, and you drop them with just a pen and paper and water somewhere where they can't see anyone else, and hopefully they're far enough away that they really feel like they're alone. And it's 2 hours, and you promise that you will come back for them, and you do, right? So they're not supposed to have a clock, a phone even. They're not supposed to have anything but a way to write down what occurs to them as it begins to occur to them. And it takes people a long time just to get their brains to shut up, first of all, just to be like, oh, I'm alone out here and there's no one to talk to. And oh my God, what am I going to have for dinner? And my feet hurt. And what did she say to me? And, like all of that. Okay, it takes a while. And 2 hours isn't really long enough. Like you need one of these weeks-long meditation retreats to get your brain to entirely be still. But the idea is write up to, 20 or more or less, whatever, questions about what you're perceiving. And yes, you'll be focusing a lot on what's in your head, and you can write those if you want, but I want 20 questions about what's outside of you. Anything, but make it outside of you. And the questions then, we finish that, I pick them up, they're done for the day or for the morning. And then the next time we meet, either that afternoon or the following day, we break into groups and we say, okay, well then, each of the 4 of you share your questions and pick your 2 favorites from each. And then figure out how you figure out the answers. Like, is the question already a hypothesis, or is the question bigger than that? In which case, how do you turn that into a hypothesis? Okay, now that you have a hypothesis, what are the predictions from the hypothesis? Given what you observed, what are the other possible hypotheses for what you observed? Do you have any sense of how it is that you might, now that you have all the possible alternative hypotheses for what you observed, how would you distinguish between those hypotheses? Now, that's a lot of work, and there's no way that groups of untrained undergrads in an hour and a half are going to get through, even all of one of those, much less 8 questions. But you begin to get experience and going like, wait, what do I have to do? I have to figure out what it might mean. I made an observation. That's true, right? It's like, well, we hope so. We don't know for sure. We need to have a few other people see the same thing you saw. But let's assume for the moment that what you saw is true. Now, what do you think it means? And then we come back together as a whole class and we start talking about some of these hypotheses. And boy, people get so animated and they start defending. Sometimes they'll stand up and be like, no, this is true. This is what I know is true. Like, you realize that 24 hours ago, you would never had a thought about this at all. And now you are actively, adamantly defending an idea that you just generated. Think about that. Maybe it's true. Cool. Maybe it's not. Also fine. But think about how not only sure you are, again with this certainty, right? But also how emotional you are about it. Like, think about the emotional valence that has now come to back your idea of like, this is science. Like, no, that's emotion. That's different. And we're humans doing science, so we can't separate it entirely. But let's try. And so that's the beginning of like, okay, how do we wrestle? And this is, of course, this is front and center when you're studying animal behavior, which is what I was often doing with these students. Like, okay, you're going to anthropomorphize because you're a human looking at the ducks or looking at the ants or looking at the moose, whatever it is. And to some degree, that's, just accept it, but always recognize it when you're doing it. When you are framing what that organism is doing through a known human bias, put that down in your notes. That's the way through, not, oh, I'm just going to pretend that didn't happen, but still write down what I think it was. Like, no, you got to own everything, and you won't get rid of your bias. But if your bias is public and seeable by others so that other people can come in and say, well, I'm coming in with a different bias, so let me see what I think, then we can begin to sort of put all these different versions together and go, okay, I think actually we're beginning to see something that's shared between all of these views on, say, what the moose was doing or what the ants were doing. And, it's different than doing science in the lab or than doing historical science or any numbers of other kinds of science, but the goal is the same. Let us try to figure out with our biased, subjective human brains and perceptual systems what is actually true in the universe. That's why we're doing it.
And I think it's that, again, this is something reading philosophy of science. Karl Popper was talking about how we can't free ourselves from bias. And he used the word historicist kind of attitude that that we can somehow, even declaring it, we can rid ourselves of it. And he's like, well, you have it. He writes this line, I think it was either in Open Society of Conjectures, Refutations. He writes this line, he's like, yeah, well, how'd that work out for you? It seems like you still have the same problem.
Yeah.
But I remember being in grad school as a molecular biologist, and my advisor was like, oh, behavior, that's soft science. We don't. And it was kind of almost just dismissed because it's like it's so subject and tainted with bias that we don't even want to get our hands dirty.
Yep.
And I think we really need to be getting our hands dirty, literally, figuratively.
Yeah. I mean, it is harder to quantify. And it is harder to reduce to its constituent parts. And there are methods that are useful in studying the behavior of animals in different contexts. Wild versus zoo is different, of course, and zoo versus lab, and animal behavior is studied in all of those settings. But you don't. One of the people on my committee, Barbara Smuts, who worked one of the preeminent researchers on baboons, did some work that I always have my animal behavior students read on sort of what is worth recording. Like what is worth, if you are out there, if you're lucky enough to be watching primates, they're still doing nothing most of the time, right? They're still just sleeping or kind of lazily picking ectoparasites off themselves most of the time. But okay, so you're going to be recording like foraging bouts, and you're going to be doing at these regular intervals, and you've got your codes, and like you know exactly what the codes are, and you always stay within the codes. But then you also have like the descriptions of like, oh, and this also is happening. And very often the most interesting stuff is something that happened once, because it's the rare event that actually is, Goodall's chimps and the war that she saw between them. She saw it once. Now, it went on for a little while, but if we count that as sort of war, it's once. Does that mean we don't get to talk about it because it's mere anecdote? No. It means we have to remind ourselves that it's been seen once. But that doesn't mean we don't get to talk about it. Right. So it's
Right.
these rubrics around like, well, you can only talk about that if you have a p-value of less than 0.05 and a sample size of more than 200. Like, well, what is a valid sample size is going to vary depending on what the question is, what the system is, and you never obscure it. Like you never claim to have seen something 8 times when you saw it once, or claim to have been looking at 30 organisms, 30 individuals when you were actually only looking at 3. You never ever do that. But sometimes if you can only find 3 individuals and they're doing something that you have described carefully, you recorded carefully, and you go back and you're like, that I think means this other thing. I can't know for sure, but boy, is it fascinating. And I'm still going to report on that. And I'm not going to claim that it's replicated. I think it does replicate out there in the world, but I haven't seen it and neither has anyone else. So I don't know for sure, but still we can talk about the thing that I for sure saw. And so that is a place where behavior the study of behavior slides into a different space. And maybe having been someone who's been thinking carefully about like the philosophy of science and how you study behavior for a long time, allowed me to more, easily say, you know what, the requirement that we only talk about data that meets these standards, no, sorry. Like you sound like you're coming from a place that has not thought about all of the variability that actually the world is made out of.
Right. It's like so dried out, the science that I'm thinking of, and procedural and careerist. And,
Yeah.
I've loved talking to you. This gives me a lot of insight into who you are and the way that you think and the way that you've been trained and the things that you've done. And it's really been just absolutely lovely. Like I said, you have such a great vibe, and I appreciate you coming on. I think you're doing great work. So,
well, it's been a total pleasure.
Keep it
and
up.
I'm going to go look up, among other things of yours, your TikTok readings of Thomas Kuhn. That's fabulous.
Oh my gosh. They're on live. I haven't recorded them yet. I'm moving and being brave like you and just putting all my conjecture out there. I'm moving towards that. I'll meet you there eventually. Yeah.
Excellent.
So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. The Big Nerve Challenge question for this episode is, How could we change science education, and I use the word education loosely, to uphold the values of trial and error and critical evaluation of evidence? Be sure to head over to my Substack for a link to this question and for all the show notes and much more.